Okay, I'm good to my mic. Alright, let me do some shit real quick before we get started. Let me make sure the stream's up and running. Alright, okay, yep. Alright, stream's good, everything's nice. I believe we should get started pretty soon now. Got 3 viewers. So how was your guys' night? How was your night? Huh? Heyo. Alright, 5 viewers. It's good. Anyway, I think maybe we should get started. I'm high and I'm here for it. I'm glad you're high because I bet these visuals are going to get well with it. And this book's going to go well with it. We're reading The Accelerationist Reader. Every stream, I'm doing a chapter of this book. So, we'll be doing the first chapter. And the reason why I'm doing it on YouTube is because I'm banned on Instagram from going live, but I don't really care. I get to do all these cool visuals that you can't do on Instagram. Anyway, the first chapter, past the introduction, which the introduction is really just, talking about, like the different sections of this book. But the first writing is Fragment on Machines by Karl Marx, which I believe is a writing from the Grundrisse. So, how about I shut up and let's get started. Once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor passes through different metamorphoses, whose culmination is the machine, or rather an automatic system of machinery. The automatic one is merely its most complete, most adequate form, and alone transforms machinery into a system. Set in motion by an automation, a moving power that moves itself. This automation consisting of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, so that the workers themselves are cast merely as its conscious linkages. In the machine, and even more in machinery as an automatic system, the use value, i.e. the material quality of the means of labor, is transformed into an existence adequate to fixed capital, and a capital as such. And the form in which it was adopted into the production process of capital, the direct means of labor, is superseded by a form posited by capital itself and corresponding to it. In no way does the machine appear as the individual worker's means of labor. Its distinguishing characteristic is not in the least, as with the means of labor, to transmit the worker's activity to the object. This activity, rather, is posited in such a way that it merely transmits the machine's work, the machine's action, onto the raw material, supervises it, and guards against interruptions. Not as with the instrument which the worker animates and makes into his organ with his skull and strength, and whose handling therefore depends on virtuosity. Rather, it is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker, is itself the virtuoso, with a soul of its own and the mechanical laws acting through it, and it consumes coal, oil, etc., just as the worker consumes food to keep up its perpetual motion. The worker's activity, reduced to a mere abstraction of activity, is determined and regulated on all sides by the movement of the machinery, and not the opposite. the science which compels the inanimate limbs of the machinery by their construction to act purposefully as an automation, does not exist in the worker's consciousness, but rather acts upon him through the machine as an alien power, as the power of the machine itself. The appropriation of living labor by objectified labor, of the power of activity which creates value by value existing for itself, including its material elements and its material motion. The production process has ceased to be a labor process in the sense of a process dominated by labor as its governing unity. Labor appears rather merely as a conscious organ scattered among the individual living workers at numerous points of the mechanical system, subsumed under the total process of the machinery itself, as itself only a link of the system, whose unity exists not in the living workers, but rather in the living active machinery, which confronts his individual insignificant doings as a mighty organism. In machinery, objectified labor confronts living labor within the labor process itself as the power which rules it, a power which, as the appropriation of living labor, is the form of capital. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery, and of living labor into a mere living accessory of this machinery as the means of its action, also posits the absorption of the labor process in its material character as a more moment of the realization process of capital. The increase of the productive force of labor and the greatest possible negation of every necessary labor is the necessary tendency of capital, as we have seen. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery is the realization of this tendency. In machinery, objectified labor materially confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself, not only by appropriating it, but in the real production process itself. The relation of capital as value which appropriates value-creating activity is, in fixed capital existing as machinery, posited at the same time as the relation of the use of capital to the used value of labor capacity. Further, the value objectified in machinery appears as a presupposition against which the value-creating power of the individual labor capacity is an infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. The production in enormous mass quantities, which is posited with machinery, destroys every connection of the product with the direct need of the producer, and hence with direct use value is already posited in the form of the product's production, and in the relations in which it is produced, that it is produced only as a conveyor of value, and its use value only as a condition to that end. In machinery, objectified labor itself appears not only in the form of product or of the product employed as means of labor, but in the form of the force of production itself. The development of the means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and skills of the general productive forces of the social brain is thus absorbed into capital, as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital, insofar that it enters in the production process as a means of production proper. Machinery appears, then, as the most adequate form of fixed capital, and fixed capital, insofar as capital relations with itself are concerned, appears as the most adequate form of capital as such. In another respect, however, insofar as fixed capital is condemned to an existence within the confines of a specific use value, it does not correspond to the concept of capital, which, as value, is indifferent to every specific form of use value, and can adopt or shed any of them as equivalent incarnations. In this respect, as regards capital's external relations, it is circulating capital which appears as the adequate form of capital, and not fixed capital. Further, insofar as machinery develops with the accumulation of society science as productive force general social labor presents itself not in labor but in capital. The productive force of society is measured in fixed capital, exists there in objective form, and inversely, The productive force of capital grows with this general progress, which capital appropriates free of charge. This is not the place to go into the development of machinery in detail, rather only in its general aspect, insofar as the means of labor, as a physical thing, loses its direct form, becomes fixed capital, and confronts the worker physically as capital. In machinery, knowledge appears as alien, external to him, and living labor as subsumed labor, self-activating, objectified labor. The worker appears as superfluous to the extent that his action is not determined by capital's requirements. The full development of capital therefore takes place where capital has posited the mode of production corresponding to it. Only when the means of labor has not only taken the economic form of fixed capital, but has also been suspended in its immediate form, and when fixed capital appears as machine within the production process, opposite labor in the entire production process appears as not subsumed under the direct skillfulness of the worker, but rather as the technological application of science. It is hence the tendency of capital to give production a scientific character. Direct labor is reduced to a mere moment of this process. As with the transformation of value into capital, so does it appear in the further development of capital, that it presupposes a certain given historical development in the productive forces on one side. Science, too, is among these productive forces, and on the other drives and forces them further onwards. Thus, the quantitative extent and the effectiveness, intensity, to which capital is developed as fixed capital indicates the general degree to which capital is developed as capital, as power over living labor, and to which it has conquered the production process as such. Also in the sense that it expresses the accumulation of objectified productive forces, and likewise of objectified labor. However, while capital gives itself its adequate form as use value within the production process only in the form of machinery and other material manifestations of fixed capital, such as railways, etc., this in no way means that this use value, machinery as such, is capital, or that its existence as machinery is identical with its existence as capital, any more than gold would cease to have use value as gold if it were no longer money. Machinery does not lose its use value as soon as it ceases to be capital. While machinery is the most appropriate form of the use value of fixed capital, it does not at all follow that therefore subsumption under the social relation of capital is the most appropriate and ultimate social relation of production for the application of machinery. To the degree that labor time, the mere quantity of labor, is posited by capital as the sole determinant element, to that degree does direct labor and its quantity disappear as the determinant principle of production, of the creation of use values, and is reduced both quantitatively to a smaller proportion and qualitatively as an, of course, indispensable but subordinate moment compared to general scientific labor, technological application of natural sciences on one side, and to the general productive force arising from social combination and total production on the other side, a combination which appears as a natural fruit of social labor, although it is a historical product. Capital thus works towards its own dissolutions as the form dominating production. While then in one respect the transformation of the production process from the simple labor process into a scientific process which subjugates the forces of nature and compels them to work in the service of human needs appears as quality of fixed capital in that contrast, the living labor. While individual labor as such has ceased altogether to appear as productive, is productive rather only in these common labors which subordinate the forces of nature to themselves, and while this elevation of direct labor into social labor appears as a reduction of individual labor to the level of helplessness in the face of the communality represented and represented by and concentrated in capital, so does it now appear, in another respect, as a quality of circulating capital. To maintain labor in one branch of production by means of coexisting labor in another. In small-scale circulation, capital advances the worker the wages which the latter exchanges for products necessary for his consumption. The money he obtains has this power only because others are working alongside him at the same time, and capital can give him claims on alien labor as the form of money, only because it has appropriated his own labor. This exchange of one's own labor with alien labor appears here not as mediated and determined by the simultaneous existence of the labor of others, but rather by the advance of which capital makes. The worker's ability to engage in the exchange of substances necessary for his consumption during production appears as due to an attribute of the part of circulating capital which is paid to the worker, and of circulating capital generally. It appears not as an exchange of substances between the simultaneous labor powers, but as the metabolism of capital, as the existence of circulating capital. Thus, all powers of labor are transposed into powers of capital, the productive power of labor into fixed capital, posited as external labor and as existing independently of it as object. And in circulating capital, the fact that the worker himself has created the conditions for the repetition of his labor, and that exchange of his his labor is mediated by the coexisting labor of others, appearing in such a way that capital gives him an advance and posits the simultaneity of the branches of labor. These last two aspects actually belong to accumulation. Capital in the form of circulating capital posits itself as mediator between the different workers. Fixed capital, in its character as means of production, whose most adequate form is machinery, produces value, i.e. increases the value of the product, in only two respects. One, insofar that it has value, i.e. is itself the product of labor, a certain quantity of labor in objectified form. 2. Insofar as it increases the relation of surplus labor to necessary labor, by enabling labor through an increase of its productive power, to create a greater mass of the products required for the maintenance of living labor capacity in a shorter time. It is, therefore, a highly absurd bourgeois assertion that the worker shares with the capitalist, because the latter, with fixed capital, which is, as far as that goes, itself a product of labor, and of alien labor merely appropriated by capital, makes labor easier for him. Rather, he robs it all of all independence and attractive character by means of the machine, or makes his labor shorter. Capital employs machinery, rather, only to the extent that it enables the worker to work a larger part of his time for capital, to relate to a larger part of his time as time which does not belong to him, to work longer for another. Through this process, the amount of labor necessary for the production of a given object is indeed reduced to a minimum, but only in order to realize a maximum of labor in the maximum number of such objects. The first aspect is important, because capital here, quite unintentionally, reduces human labor, expenditure of energy to a minimum. This will redound to the benefit of emancipated labor, and is the condition of its emancipation. From what has been said, it is clear how absurd Lauderdale is when he wants to make fixed capital into an independent source of value, independent of labor time. It is such a source only in so far that as it itself objectified labor time, and so far as it posits surplus labor time. The employment of machinery itself historically presupposes superfluous hands. Machinery inserts itself to replicate labor only where there is an overflow of labor powers. Only in the imagination of economists does it leap to the aid of the individual worker. It can be effective only with the masses of the workers, whose concentration relative to capital is one of its historic presuppositions, as we have seen. It enters not in order to replace labor power where this is lacking, but rather in order to produce massively available labor power to its necessary measure. Machinery enters only where labor capacity is on hand in masses. From the moment when fixed capital has development to a certain extent, and this extent, as we indicated, is the measure of the development of large industry generally, hence fixed capital increases in proportion to the development of large industry's productive forces, it is itself the objectification of these productive forces as presupposed product from this instant on, every interruption of its initial value. The value of fixed capital is reproduced only insofar as it is used up in production process. Through disuse, it loses its use value without making value passing on to the product. Hence, the greater the scale on which the fixed capital develops, in the sense in which we regard it here, the more does the continuity of the production process, or the constant flow of reproduction, becomes an externally compelling condition for the mode of production founded on capital. In machinery, the appropriation of living labor by capital achieves a direct reality in this respect as well. It is firstly the analysis and application of mechanical and chemical laws arising directly out of science, which enables the machine to perform the same labor as that previously performed by the worker. However, the development of machinery along this path occurs only when large industry has already reached a higher stage, and all the sciences have been pressed into the service of capital, and when, secondly, the available machinery itself already provides great capabilities. Invention then becomes a business, and the application of science to direct production itself becomes a prospect which determines and solicits it. But this is not the road along which machinery by and large arose, and even less the road on which it progresses in detail. This road is rather dissection through the division of labor. This road is rather I already read that. This road is rather dissection through the division of labor, which gradually transforms the workers' operations into more and more mechanical ones, so that at a certain point a mechanism can step into their places. Thus, the specific mode of working here appears directly as becoming transferred from the worker to capital in the form of the machine, and his own labor capacity devalued thereby. Hence, the worker's struggle against machinery. What was the living worker's activity becomes the activity of the machine. Thus, the appropriation of labor by capital confronts the worker in a coarsely sensuous form. Capital absorbs labor into itself, as though its body were by love possessed. The exchange of living labor for objectified labor, i.e., the positing of social labor in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labor, is the ultimate development of the value relation and of production resting on value. Its presupposition is and remains the mass of direct labor time. The quantity of labor employed as the determinant factor of the production of wealth. But to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on amount of labor employed then on the power of the agencies set in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportions to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress of technology, or the application of this science to production. The development of this science, especially of natural science and all others with the latter, is itself in turn related to the development of material production. Agriculture becomes merely the application of the science of material metabolism. Its regulation for the greatest advantage of the entire body of society. Real wealth manifests itself rather in large industry reveals this, and the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and its product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor reduced to a pure abstraction, and the power of the production process it superintends. Labor no longer appears so much to be included with the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator to the production process of itself. What holds for machinery holds likewise for the combination of human activities and the development of human intercourse. No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing as a middle link between the object and himself. Rather, he inserts the process of nature transformed into an industrial process as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being his chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power, his understanding of nature and his mastery over it by virtue of his presence as a social body. It is, in a word, the development of the social individual which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time, on which the present wealth is based, appears as a miserable foundation in the face of this new one, created by large-scale industry itself, as soon as labor in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of health. Labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. The surplus labor of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as non-labor of the few for the development of the general powers of the human head. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down, and the direct material production process is stripped of the form of Peinerian antithesis. The free development of individualities, and hence not the reduction of necessary labor time so as to posit surplus labor, but rather the general reduction of the necessary labor of society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific, and etc. Development of the individuals in time set free, and which the means created for all of them. Capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time, on the other side, as sole measure and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in the superfluous form, hence posits the superfluous in growing measure as a condition. Question of life or death for the necessary. On the one side, then, it calls to life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent, relatively, of the labor time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labor time as the measuring rod for giant social forces thereby created, and to confine them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of social individual, appear to capital as mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material conditions to blow this foundation sky high. Truly wealthy a nation, when the working day is 6 rather than 12 hours, wealth does not command over surplus time, real wealth, but rather disposable time outside that needed indirect production for every individual and the whole society. Nature builds no machines, no locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. These are products of human industry. Natural material transformed into organs of the human will over nature or of human participation in nature. They are organs of the human brain, created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. Development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree hence the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice of the real life process. The creation of a large quantity of disposable time apart from necessary labor time for society generally and each of its members, i.e. room for the development of the individual's full productive forces, hence those of society also. This creation of not labor time appears in the stage of capital as all earlier ones, as not labor time, free time for a few. What capital adds is that it increases the surplus labor of time of the mass by all the means of art and science, because its wealth consists directly of the appropriation of surplus labor time, since values directly its purpose, not use value. It is thus, despite itself, instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time, in order to reduce labor time for the whole society to a diminishing minimum, and thus to free everyone's time for their own development. But its tendency always on the one side to create disposable time, on the other to convert it into surplus labor. If it succeeds too well at the first, then it suffers from surplus production, and then necessary labor is interrupted, because no surplus labor can be realized by capital. The more this contradiction develops, the more does it become evident that the growth of the forces of production can no longer be bound up with the appropriation of alien labor, but that the mass of workers must themselves appropriate their own surplus labor. Once they have done so, indisposable time thereby ceases to have an antithetical existence. Then, on one side, necessary labor time will be measured by the needs of the social individual, and on the other, the development of power of social production will grow so rapidly that even though production is now calculated for wealth of all, disposable time will grow for all. For real wealth is developed productive power of all individuals. The measure of wealth is then not any longer in any way labor time, but rather disposable time. Labor time, as the measure of value, posits wealth itself as founded on poverty, and disposable time as existing in and because of the antithesis to surplus labor time, or the positing of an individual's entire time as labor time, and his degradation therefore to mere worker, subsumption under labor. The most developed machinery thus forces the worker to work longer than the savage does, or than he himself did with the simplest, crudest tools. If the entire labor of a country were sufficient only to raise the support of the whole population, there would be no surplus labor. Consequently, nothing that could be allowed to accumulate as capital. If in 1 year the people raises enough for the support of 2 years, 1 year's consumption must perish, or for 1 year men must cease from productive labor. But the possessors of the surplus produce or capital employ people upon something not directly immediately productive, e.g. in the erection of machinery. So it goes on. Real economy saving consists of the saving labor time minimum and minimization of production costs, but this saving is identical with the development of the productive force. Hence, in no way abstinence from consumption, but rather the development of power, of capabilities of production, and hence both the capabilities as well as the means of consumption. The capability to consume is a condition of consumption. Hence, its primary means and their capability is the development of an individual potential, a force of production. The saving of labor time is equal to an increase of free time, i.e., time for the full development of the individual, which in turn reacts back upon the productive power of labor as itself the greatest productive power. From the standpoint of the direct production process, it can be regarded as the production of fixed capital. This fixed capital being man himself, it goes without saying, by the way, that direct labor time itself cannot remain in the abstract antithesis to free time in which it appears from the perspective of bourgeois economy. Labor cannot become play, as Fourier would like, although it remains his great contribution to have expressed this suspension. God damn it, I lost my spot. I'm just going to start. Fourier would like, although it remains his great contribution to have expressed the suspension not of distribution, but of the mode of production itself, in a higher form, as the ultimate object. Free time, which is both idle time and time for higher activity, has naturally transformed its processor. Has transformed its possessor into a different subject, and he then enters into the direct production process as this different subject. This process is then both discipline, as regards the human being, in the process of becoming, and at the same time practice, experimental science, materially creative and objectifying science, as regards the human being who has become, in whose head exists the accumulated knowledge of society. Goddamn. That was Fragment on Machines by Karl Marx in the Accelerationist Manifesto, not Manifesto, fuck, the Accelerationist Reader book. That's the first chapter in the book, which was written in, what was that chapter, 1858, I believe that it was, in the Grundrisse, as I said in the beginning, but, yeah, oh my fucking god, I need some water. Good thing I have some right here, but let's see how many people are actually still in here. 3, nice. But I plan on doing more in the future. I'm going through this entire book. Each stream will be dedicated to a chapter of this book. So when I do these streams, if you have this book or a PDF of it, I probably should have said this in the beginning, you can follow along with me. Anyway, more projects that I have planned in the future other than these streams. I'm going to be doing another video that is accelerationism and the CCRU's connection with occultism, which will be a collaboration with my good friend Aiden. Shout out Aiden at I forgot your fucking at fake Isfel. I don't fucking know how to pronounce that shit. On Instagram, and I think the Twitter at is the same. I could be wrong. I could be very, very wrong. But yeah, I was very wrong. It's on Twitter. His Twitter is dead triumvirate. I don't fucking know. I don't know how to pronounce this shit. Get some handles that I can pronounce. God damn it, Aiden. But he's gonna help with the video. And then past that, I don't know what I'm fucking doing with this channel. I guess more videos like that, but I don't know what videos to do, so I was thinking about like doing a video on like post-humanism and cyber-nihilism and stuff like that. But yeah, there's not much left to talk about here. So, goodbye. Thanks to everyone who came and sat with me reading this great work of Marx. And I'll see you.